The Royal Domain of Drottningholm is located on Queen's Island in Lake Mälar, outside Stockholm. The island's name acknowledges the closely interwoven history of the castle with the different queens of Sweden. The ensemble of Drottningholm Castle, Theatre, Chinese Pavilion and Gardens is a magnificent example of a royal residence built in 18th century Sweden. The complex represents the typical architecture of that period, heir to influences exerted by the Chateau of Versailles on the construction of royal residences in Western, Central and Northwestern Europe. The Royal Domain of Drottningholm was the first Swedish site on the World Heritage List. The crucial factor for the decision by the World Heritage Committee was the presence of two specific buildings in the domain, the Chinese Pavilion and the Drottningholm Theatre. Drottningholm Castle was built by the Queen Dowager Hedvig Eleonora. Work began at the end of the 17th century under the architects Nicodemus Tessin the Elder and was completed by his son Nicodemus Tessin the Younger. The stucco facades were colored pale red, while the cornice, pilasters and moldings were painted with pale gray oil paint. The yellow color has naturally varied in brightness over the centuries. In the 1960s, the facades were plastered with a lime cement plaster, and the cornice was painted with resin-based paint. The lime cement plaster has resulted in a different effect on the plastered surface, as the tinting with lime cement paint ages in a different way from the traditional lime color. Painting with resin-based paint has led to certain technical problems, as a watertight paint layer holds moisture, resulting in serious erosion. The object of the current facade renovation, begun in 1997, is to get as close as possible to the appearance the buildings had at the end of the 18th century, when the whole structure was complete and all the buildings had a common yellow color scheme. In this context, the use of traditional materials is important. It gives an authentic historic sense to surfaces and color treatment, even when one gets close to the building. This means using lime plaster tinted with lime paint and moldings and woodwork painted with linseed oil paint. Today, the palace is the official residence of the Swedish royal family. A large part of it is nevertheless open to the public. Since 1991, the Palace of Drottningholm with the Palace Theatre, Chinese Pavilion, and the Great Park have been included in UNESCO's World Heritage List. Since the reign of King Johann III in the 16th century, there has been a palace garden at Drottningholm. At that time, it was primarily a utility garden and was situated approximately where the parking area, east of the theatre, is located today. The park and gardens at Drottningholm were developed in 3 stages, inspired by 3 main styles: the Baroque garden, the English garden, and the French garden. The oldest garden was planted at the end of the 1600s, upon the initiative of Queen Hedvig Eleonora. The work was directed by the palace architects Tessin, father and son. This part of the garden is known as the Baroque garden and is situated directly adjacent to the palace, enclosed by 4 lime tree-lined avenues. The architects were inspired by newly planted palace gardens in France at the time, where the ideal was strict, ordered and symmetrical. The Baroque garden lay in disrepair during the 1800s, but was restored in the 1950s and 60s by King Gustav IV Adolf. Here is the English garden style, a picturesque garden style which emerged in England in the 18th century, one of the growing currents of the larger Romantic movement. The manicured hills, lakes, and trees dotted with allegorical temples were sculpted into the land. The English garden presented an idealized view of nature. When Gustav III took over Drottningholm in 1777, he wished to make room for the new park ideal from England, the Natural Landscape Park or English Garden. Frederick Magnus Piper, who studied these gardens firsthand in England, was commissioned in 1780 to create such a garden to the north of the Baroque garden. This garden is made up of 2 ponds with canals, islets, and beautiful bridges, expansive lawns, as well as tree-lined avenues and tree groves. Walkways wind themselves all around the park. Viewing paths stretch through the English garden and partly through the Baroque garden, providing beautiful viewpoints and landscaped vistas. The exterior of the Court Theatre is an exquisite example of Scandinavian design, with pure simplicity in its forms. Drottningholm Theatre is one of the best preserved Baroque theatres in Europe. It was built between 1764 and 1766, but its true period of greatness did not start until 1777, when Gustav III took over the castle. After the death of Gustav III, theatrical performances were discontinued, and the theatre fell into disuse. The first golden age of the theatre was initiated by King Gustav III in 1777. Together with actors like Monvel, the composers Naumann and Krauss, the ballet master Gallaudier, and the architect Desprez, Gustav used Drottningholm to inject new life into Swedish theatre and opera. Up to his death in 1792, when the theatre was closed, the repertoire included Gluck's latest works, opéra comique, French classical dramas, and pantomime ballets. The Chinese pavilion was built in 1769 to replace a wooden pavilion from 1753. The architecture is basically French Rococo, but it also has an exotic character, with Chinese and other Oriental elements, which were the height of fashion at the time. The Chinese pavilion reflects the European taste for chinoiserie of the 18th century. The combination of a French-inspired architecture with exteriors displaying the European idea of China offers an altogether unique chance to witness this very fashionable trend from the 18th century. The pavilion, located in the southeast corner of the park, is like an exotic silhouette of the Grand Trianon at Versailles. It was a favorite rendezvous place for Gustav III, who loved to pass summer days here with his court. The royal family still lives here, though the royal apartments are guarded and closed to visitors. The Royal Guards is a service unit of the Swedish Armed Forces, which has responsibility for the protection of the Swedish royal family at their castles. The Royal Palace at Drottningholm is one such residence, Stockholm another. The guards march in crisp blue uniforms in tight formation to the Royal Palace, often accompanied by a military band. Upon arrival at the palace, they launch into a 35-minute display of precision marching, flag waving, and all business attitudes. The other inspiration for the creation of the gardens was the French gardens from Versailles. At the center of the garden we find the Hercules fountain. Its bronze figures the creation of the sculptor Adrien de Vries. After a walled terrace comes a parterre d'eau with 10 jets of water and lawns enclosed by boxwood hedges. Closest to the palace lies a parterre de broderie, which originally had an intricate embroidery pattern of boxwood hedges and colored gravel. Today, these have been replaced by a large lawn with boxwood hedges on the outer edges, as well as a band of crushed brick and black hyperstein. Throughout the years, the interior of the Drottningholm Palace has changed, as the royal personages who lived here have left their mark on the palace's interiors, influenced by changes in style and fashion trends. The interior of the castle was decorated between 1665 and 1703, at first in a heavy, sumptuous Baroque style, but later increasingly refined to French patterns. One of the palace's most important rooms is the library, created during the extensive reconstruction of the castle carried out in 1747. At that time, an additional floor was added, and the long gallery was first converted into a gallery of paintings. Ornamentation in the form of medallions and other decorations, monograms and tables of text highlights the library's function. The guard room north of the main floor is one of the 4 rooms of the castle's guards. The guards' rooms were designed to prohibit unauthorized visitors access to the royal apartments. The green room is the first part of the suite of staterooms. After the simplicity of the decoration of the guard room, visitors are struck by the richness as well as the splendor of the ornamentation in the suite, which seem only to increase with each room visited. The original decor, much of it heavy with symbolism, has been perfectly preserved to the present day, as have the doors and woodwork. This room reflects the different historical styles of decoration, which together have left their mark on all the staterooms of the floor. The Ehrenstrahl courtroom was where Queen Hedwig Eleonora received guests and tributes. A painting evokes the regency, seated on a throne. The following tableau represents the accession to the throne of Charles X, with Eleanor transmitting the royal scepter. The castle is essentially a construction from the second half of the 17th century, designed by Nicodemus Tessin the Elder. Like most great monuments, the castle has undergone many changes during successive reconstructions and extensions to keep up with the new and evolving needs of its occupants, as well as changing styles and fashions. The palace's several art galleries contain portraits of queens, kings, and generals, all regularly represented. Some rooms are designed to honor the memory of Sweden's kings and their glorious country. The Hall of Generals is one of those memorial halls. The Charles XI Gallery is arranged to celebrate the exploits of the warrior kings. The battle scenes painted by Lemke evoke episodes of the war against Denmark. The ceiling painting, entitled Goodwill Waking the Echoes of War Victories, was executed by Silvius Fama. This staircase is the most sumptuous work of this kind ever designed by the first architect of the old castle, Nicodemus Tessin. Work began in 1665, and the ornamentation of the lower part was executed under his direction. The staircase dominates the central body of the castle, which occupies the entire height. The stairs also create a trompe-l'oeil through lateral panels, whose space appears to extend beyond each side of the castle. The ceiling's painting celebrates the glory of the Queen Dowager Hedwig Eleanor, together with the Greek god Apollo, the god of the arts and sciences. Six busts executed by Millik are portraits of the legendary Nordic kings, whose presence here is a reminder that the Swedish monarchy dates back to time immemorial. The ceremonial room of Hedwig Eleonora was the center of the floor of representation, typical of the royal palaces of the 17th century. It served as a courtroom where official guests were received by the sovereign and her ministers. A gilded ceiling medallion depicting two candles bears the inscription Consiglio Dei, God's Council. The color of the walls was changed to blue in 1701. The visitor who strolls through the castle's parks will naturally move from a formal garden with its precise layout, designed in the late 17th century, through the English garden with its greater stylistic freedom that became popular some 100 years later, to tree groves dating from the 1760s near the Chinese pavilion. These distinct parts of the garden, with their well-defined characteristics, reflect the many changes in styles and tastes over the years. But the tradition of the garden at Drottningholm dates even farther back in time. Under the reign of John III in the late 16th century, a garden at the current location of the tennis court near the Eastern Theatre already existed. According to ancient sources, he cultivated such typical Swedish plants as cherry, apple, and pear trees, as well as medlar, mulberry, and peach trees, together with carnations in pots. The combination of the exotic Chinese pavilion pleasure palace, the Palace Theatre, and the magnificent palace gardens make a visit to Drottningholm a unique experience. The palace now serves as the present royal family's permanent residence. The rooms in the southern wing of the palace are reserved for this purpose, while the rest of the palace and grounds are open to the public year-round. Bronze sculptures dating back to the beginning of the 1600s were brought to Sweden as war booty and were eventually placed in the Drottningholm Palace Park. Today, these sculptures have been replaced by modern bronze casts, and the originals can be seen at the Museum de Vries. The museum contains the world's largest collection of the work of late Renaissance Dutch sculptor Adrian de Vries. Drottningholm Palace was erected at a time when Sweden could claim to be one of Europe's great powers. Construction of the palace and its gardens was also the most ambitious and most expensive ever undertaken in the country of Sweden, and was carried out at the request of the ruling monarch of the time. Considerable work has been carried out recently in order to restore the Baroque gardens to their original splendor, and a particular effort was made so that the park's many fountains could function as they once did. The best way to get to Drottningholm Castle from Stockholm is by boat. The scenery and the easy pace of the cruise allows visitors to enjoy the wonderful atmosphere of this scenic area. Regular boat services in summertime depart from Stockholm City Hall Quay to Drottningholm.